Welcome to the Building State Capability seminar series. This is our first one for this calendar year, and we're really excited to have Daniel Agbiboa here with us. He is the Assistant Professor of African and American Studies at Harvard University. He earned a PhD in International Development from the University of Oxford and an MPhil in Development Studies from the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on how state and non-state forms of order and authority interpenetrate and shape each other, and the relationship between mobility, power, and politics in urban Africa. He is the author of this wonderful book called They Eat Our Sweat: Transport, Labor, Corruption, and Everyday Survival in Urban Nigeria. We are really excited to have Daniel here. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you.
And welcome to all of our audience who is here on Zoom. We're excited to have you. The order of the session is we're going to do this a conversation style. And after that, we will take Q&A. So if you have questions, you can post them in the chat. For the audience here, we will take live questions at the end. And then Daniel will answer your questions. Great. Thank you very much. There's also some information about building state capability. For those of you who are on Zoom, we'll be sharing that with you. For those of you in the room, there is stuff on the pillars, etc., to learn more about who we are and what we do. Okay, without further ado, Daniel, what inspired you to write this book?
Great question. Great place to start. First, let me thank you all for coming during this launch period. And I'm excited to obviously talk about a book that has been a while in the making. The starting point, what inspired me to write this book, is in many ways very personal. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, which is Nigeria's commercial capital, but also Africa's largest metropolis. And my parents were civil servants who around about the mid-1990s, dabbled into the informal transport sector. Now, the informal transport sector, the popular transport sector, is a sector that is not unique to Nigeria, but it's actually quite dominant in the global south. You know, they call it the Dala-Dalas in Dar es Salaam, the Trotros in Ghana, the Matatus in Nairobi, the Esprit de Corps in DRC, or the Spirit of the Dead, because of their propensity for accidents. So they are quite familiar to anyone who's navigated the African city. So they dabbled into it as a form of supplementing their income. This was a period on the back of the structural adjustment program in Nigeria, which was implemented in 1986, on the back of the oil bust, when Nigeria experienced an oil boom, and then due to some external shocks, had oil bust and needed rescue package, which came in the form of the IMF World Bank Reform Package, which was really about removing bureaucrats from business in order to strengthen Nigeria's economy. But unfortunately, did not work for a host of reasons. And the removal of the state from social provisioning plunged many households into severe poverty. And many had to adopt multiple modes of survival to sort of get by and make do. Something that is not at all, again, unique to Nigeria at that period. Many people work multiple jobs today to complement their wages in order to get by. My parents, being civil servants, decided to pool resources together and buy a minibus taxi, which they believed would do two things: would take us to school, bring us back, and in between, sort of make money. So that was the whole idea, to blur this sort of public-private responsibility. But it ended up to be a huge disappointment for them, something that they have not forgotten and certainly not forgiven the drivers who were implicated in it. From their point of view, it was a case of dishonesty, even though this driver that they employed to run this business came through trusted networks like a Nigerian pastor. But this, in their view, the driver was dishonest, formed all sort of collusion with other extortionists on the road, including mechanics, street-level bureaucrats like police officers, motor park touts who worked for the National Union of Road Transport Workers, or in some sort of network to extort money from them. So every day was, so I recall fondly the joy of having someone drive you to school. In Nigeria, owning a car is a status thing. No matter how old or rickety the vehicle is, it was always something to be proud of. So we grew up with that sort of pride of owning a minibus taxi. But at the same time, it was not lost on me that there were constant argument and fighting back and forth between my parents and the driver and the conductor. It was always over money issues. It was one money today, one money tomorrow. The car was broken, the car was working. Sometimes my parent had to leave work to sort of monitor this guy and see what he was doing. But anyway, they went into debt because of essentially this business, which was supposed to supplement them. But I always felt many years later, when the opportunity came to do a PhD at Oxford, that I was always going to do something around corruption because it was so ingrained in everyday life. It was something that I observed cumulatively. So I wanted to understand the system because at the same time, the anti-corruption campaign in Nigeria and much of Africa was really designed to put the bad guys behind bars. And I always felt that it did not really plug into the kind of corruption that I experienced on a daily basis, the social dynamics of corruption, the corruption that was there and not there, sort of a spectral phenomenon. So that was always something that I was interested in. But then it was too broad and I needed to ground it. And for me, the first sort of place to start was the place of transport, because something that I experienced. And I always wanted to see the story, not from my parents' point of view, which was a dishonest sector, a sector that was not trustworthy, but also from the point of view of the anonymous, even nameless driver who was stigmatized as a con doctor. And I never really got to hear their own point of view. So this was very important for me because informal transport workers across Africa, South Asia, they have an identity of being what the sociologist government calls dirty workers. They are seen as violent. They are seen as, in fact, they are the occupation that you don't want your child to grow up to become. So I wanted to understand beyond this stereotype, beyond this sort of facade, what is the sort of plight of these workers? What is their own story? It was important to plug into the feelings of my parent because it allowed me to understand sort of the precarity of ownership. Sometimes precariousness is always sort of seen as the preserve of workers alone. But I was able to understand that you can own something and also be in a very precarious position. So that was important. But I wanted to understand the mutuality of precarity, that it wasn't just one against the other, that there was a sort of circulation that happened. And so I wanted to understand from the driver's point of view and more broadly from the point of view of informal transport workers. So this was the inspiration to go back and try to understand what was going on at the time.
Great. So you get to Lagos, you've got a plan, you've got a methodology, you're going to interview a lot of people, and then that's not what you did.
Yes. I tore up the paper, the whole formal ethics, approval, everything was done to go and study corruption in the informal transport sector. Being a social scientist, it was about interviews, semi-structured interviews, in-depth interviews. It was about talking with the stakeholders that were involved. It was all very straightforward. And hence it was approved. But I go on the ground and 2 weeks, a few days into my field work, I have this sort of chance encounter with a former schoolmate. And he happened to be a minibus taxi driver, Danfos as they are called, hurry up. And we get talking and I tell him about my research and he tells me, you won't get much with the kind of approach that you want to take. If you want to understand really the mutuality of corruption, what happens from within, then you have to be a driver or at least be a conductor. So drivers just seemed too daunting for me. So I left it for him and I said, okay, I would work as a conductor. My supervisor, luckily, the late Abdul Mustafa, as radical as it gets, was open and worked with me through the ethics process to ensure that I was able to carry out this kind of research, this kind of learning by doing research. So this is what happened. I became a conductor running one of the most difficult routes. So between Alimosho local government, which is the largest local government area in Lagos, and Oshodi, which is the central hub in Lagos. Everywhere you want to go to, if you get to Oshodi, you'll be able to find a connection to that point. So it was as easy as it gets. And I navigated several checkpoints, dangerous checkpoints, but also checkpoints of conviviality and sociality. So it was this mixture of danger, but also a sort of affect, friendliness, a sort of performance of violence that I navigated on a daily basis. So there was a real embodied knowledge, things I had to learn by just doing. And it was then that I began to experience what it felt like to be an informal transport worker. The sort of distrust. You embodied as a conductor all that was wrong with the city. You were the sort of the punching bag of the passengers who were frustrated with the dysfunctionality of the context and would often displace their aggression towards you. You were, in essence, never really seen as a person. You were the part of what is called the non-incorporated, those who are not part of the realm of humanity. You existed outside of humanity, so to speak. So I had that embodied experience of what it means, and I think it really informed the kind of research that I wrote in a way that is filled with empathy, that really understands positionality. And I'll say more a little bit later on about the need to reflect on one's own positionality within the sector. But I was an outsider within. So even though I was part of the sector, I was not permanently part of the sector. There was always an escape route for me. And there was the whole aspect of my family being scandalized that I would even be part of this sector. And I remember when I even broached the idea, my mom wanted to follow me to the motor parks. I said, "You've done your own share back in the 1990s. Let me do this one." But this was how it happened. It was a chance encounter. I went to the field with a very clear idea of what I wanted to do, and it was blown in my face with this encounter. And that's what the city does to you. It's a space that is both strange and familiar, and it's unpredictable, and you have to be open to the unpredictability because that in itself is a resource.
And how long did you do this for?
So this was for a year. I did the conductor work for 2 months. It was impossible for me to continue beyond that. Just the wear and tear that it has on your body, the insults, the psychological impact it has on you just meant that I could not continue, which made me realize that for many who are sort of trapped in this system, there's nowhere to go to. You have to navigate the system. You have to face the system squarely. And so sometimes we look at these people as the tough guys of the city, the rugged guys of the city, but the toll that it takes on them, the work, it's synonymous to what you may call a slow violence or a slow kind of death. Just a systematic exhaustion to the body of having to navigate this many this violent and unpredictable system. I think more than the actual violence, it was the fact that fear was a way of life in this space. The fact that there was always the possibility of violence, not so much the enactment of the violence itself, was something that was just exhausting. So this was what happened. I just could not endure, sustain the energy with which I came in.
2 months is a long time.
Yes.
I'm not sure many in this room would actually have lasted 2 months. Can you give some color? You've talked about navigating this. It's a really difficult job. What does a day in the life of a conductor look like? For those of you who've never had that experience, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. A day in the life of a conductor. I think to understand that question, we have to begin by saying that one of my favorite minibus slogans, and again, if you know the informal transport sector, they are sort of mobile bodies of meaning. On their bodies are always all these graffiti and different slogans that That is a way in which they, as marginal actors, are able to enact their voice in a city that often looks beyond them, in a city that renders them anonymous and surplus. One of my favorite slogans is "Life is war," and underneath that slogan is 24 hours on the road. Another slogan says "Ghetto boy, no time to check time." So all of these this is a space that is conceived as so when you wake up in the morning and you go to work, you're going to battle. You're going to battle with forces, not just physical forces, but also forces that are beyond that are more than the eyes can meet. So this is how they conceive of their work. And so you don't go into battle unprepared. So therefore, to prepare themselves for battle, you do various things. First, it's early it's making hay not while the sun shines, but before the sun shines. You have to wake up early because you have to avoid all the extortionists on the road. So so waking up around 4 or 3 sometimes in the morning. And there are a range of things that you would do as a conductor in conjunction with the driver. You would pray. For journey messes, you would ask, and some would make sacrifices, token sacrifices to their deities, which is often at intersections, which are seen as that potent place where most of the corruption and violence happens, to sort of protect them through this sort of treacherous business. Some would hit the drinking, the beer parlors, as they are called, to sort of immune themselves to the various insults and risks that abide in this sector. So those are sort of the range of things that you do as a conductor to prepare yourself. But it was always a sense that this is a space of war, and you had to be prepared for it. And so that's how you went through life.
It's interesting that you call it prepare for war.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Can you unpack, like, what does war on the street look like? What are things that could happen to you?
Yes. Let me turn it around and say, earlier on I said, or rather, when the language of corruption is used in Africa and more broadly the global South, it's always the language of militarization. People come into power and say they want to wage war on corruption. We say the war on corruption, isn't it? It's almost like the war on terrorism. What I experienced was a cold kind of war. It was a war that was a mixture of the spectacular, which is that you could be literally shot dead for refusing to pay bribes to a police officer. But it was also spectral. It was not there. It was most of the time when you go to these spaces, people are cracking jokes, people are eating together. So you feel, oh, well, where's the violence? But it's always there. It's in the possibility that things can suddenly change in your face. So there was that war. So in 2 months, for example, I witnessed the death of about 4 conductors. Now, these are violent deaths that were just literally, these guys were just pulled down from minibus taxis in motion. Why? Because they refused to pay bribes to motor park touts who work for the National Union of Road Transport Workers, which is the most politicized and violent union in Nigeria. And some of those deaths occurred in full view of the traffic police officer, who simply looked the other way because they're sort of in on the game. These transport workers who work with them, collect money from them. In fact, literally one of the money they collect is owolopa, which is money for the police. So in a sense, there's a certain mutuality in this regard, in such a way then that I wouldn't say the transport operators are entirely passive without agents, but it's a sense in which you give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, so you can go on your way. So that's the kind of what we're talking about. But you're also dealing with an infrastructure that swallows people in form of the road, the potholes, the accidents, just the traffic congestion that means that you are just slowly dying in traffic, and the pollution that is in that space as well. So that is also a form of death as well, that you have to, form of war that you have to endure and you have to pray to avert. And this is not unique to the transport drivers, it's also to the transport the passengers as well. And, there's always a play on the slogans on the body of these minibus taxis. For example, these taxi slogans, they have this double meaning where they tell you what is going to happen, but at the same time, they reassure you. So it's this danger and comfort. For example, they could say, experience is the best teacher. So you're looking at this minibus taxi that is just like on its last leg, and it says experience is the best teacher. It says all that glitters is not gold. It's telling you, don't just go with these young guys driving the flashy ones and blaring this Tupac music. Trust that, as one slogan puts it, it still moves. So this thing is old, but it will get you where you want to be. Some would say coming to carry you home, which is almost a subtle way of telling you that this is a flying coffin. And you could be, and one other slogan says 6 feet. Which is just essentially reminding people of the fact that of the proximity of life to death, and both the biopolitics and necropolitics of making die and letting die. That is part of this space called the transport sector. So the slogans themselves, if you read them carefully, you can understand the kind of space that you're in. But it's also a case that these slogans was a form of competition where people could gain a competitive advantage. Nigeria was ranked, I think, in the 2000s as one of the most religious space in the world. And people really, so many of these slogans were religiously embedded. So people really trust when they say the blood of Jesus, or when they say fear not or anointed. People feel a certain comfort in going with these drivers because they feel there's a sort of a divine intervention that is in this space. So this is sort of the broader picture that you can read from the city itself rather than from outside the city.
Thank you so much. Now, you started because you wanted to learn more about corruption, right? What did you learn about corruption?
Excellent question. What is corruption?
That's right. Exactly. Let's start with what is corruption.
Yeah, what is corruption? That's what the question that sort of throngs the gateway of my senses when I went to the field. Nigeria has at least 500 languages. And one of the first things I realized was that there was no direct translation for the meaning of corruption in any of these languages. Joseph Nye, who is the former director of the Harvard Kennedy School, famously defined corruption as the use of public office for private gain. When I went to the field, it was hard for me to see what the public was and what the private was. In fact, in many ways, not using public office for private gain was to be perceived as corrupt because there was a commensality around food and eating that blurred the boundaries between the public and the private. So in a sense, then, one of the first things that I encountered was that there was no direct translation for the word corruption. Corruption, in fact, the closest I got was the Hausa word zalunci, which means oppression. So corruption, people instead would use idioms of eating and not eating well enough or eating too much to describe corruption, which tells me that there was an intimacy at the heart of corruption. And eating together, there's an intimacy around that as well in these spaces. So there was a mutuality and intimacy and affect that characterized corruption that made it not there but here. And so that was the first lesson that I learned. The second thing was that many of you have probably experienced one email or another telling you that they are the lawyer to the late Nigerian president and telling you that they have a lot of money in the bank. They just need your bank account to be able to sort of get hold of this money and distribute and pay your school fees and give you some stipends. So there's a lot of these sort of, and images of the Nigerian prince is very, widespread. So there's a culture of corruption that is often dominant in popular media. But one thing I discovered from being a conductor and talking and being in that social space of the motor parks and the bus terminal was that it was as much a culture of corruption as it was against corruption. People would often condemn corruption. People would always agonize over the corruption that they experience on a daily basis. And so there was a paradox there in which people at the same time gave into corruption and reproduced that corruption. So I wanted to understand, why do people sort of denounce the very practice that they reproduce in their daily lives? And probing that, I quickly realized that the corruption was people were, as one minibus taxi driver puts it, when you fail to engage with corruption, you die, you cease to exist, you become anonymous. So people were compelled to reproduce this corruption that did damage to them. It almost reminds me of the political theorist Laura Ballant's work on what she calls cruel optimism, in which people get attached to the very thing that hurts them. And reproduce that very thing, that maintain relationships that ultimately is not good for them. So I think there was a certain cruel optimism around corruption in Nigeria, in which one could be mistaken to say that Nigeria is fantastically corrupt, as the former British Prime Minister noted. But what is missing is the fact that they feel trapped into a system that they have to engage with, they have to negotiate with, through various tactics and strategies in order to survive. So that was another key understanding of corruption, that corruption was something that was closely related to survival, the struggle for survival. And people, and so when we talk about a culture of corruption, there's nothing inherently flawed about people, or feckless about people, that made them sort of embrace corruption. In fact, I have struggled to find a country that is as critical of corruption as Nigeria is. And the elections are coming yet again, and Nigerians are very concerned about corruption. And we know, on the back of what happened with George Floyd in the fall of 2020, Nigerian youth went in social protest through what is called the EndSARS movement against police brutality and extortion, rejecting corruption yet again. But these were not the misbehaving youth that the president made them out to be. These were patriotic youth. They were holding their national flags. They were dancing to the national anthem in what Kianga Yamata Taylor calls the festival of the oppressed. And yet they were shot dead in cold blood. So again, this was something that was very, it was important for me to set the record straight, that this was not a culture of corruption, but it was a culture against corruption. And that we need to move beyond this sense that a certain country is fantastically corrupt, or that they are inherently feckless or inherently given to corruption, which sometimes is how the narrative is put out there.
Yeah, I really like this blur that you have. It's not black and white, right? Yeah. You started off by saying the corrupt guys go to jail. There's only those corrupt guys. Yep. Like, it's a whole culture, it's a whole system. There's different levels. There is no us versus them.
Yeah, no us versus them. You have to think about corruption in terms of you have to apportion blame. It's not a case of Nigeria's problem simply being the problem of leaders, right? The ordinary citizen is implicated in the very discourse and practice of corruption in such a way then that this us versus them thing will not get us anywhere. In fact, most anti-corruption campaigns has always been designed around sort of a state logic of trying to catch these guys who loot billions of dollars. And what the point that is missing is the social dynamics of corruption. The fact that the everyday and the political are intimately related. The fact that the street logic and the state logic are closely intertwined. And so this was something that was very a key point in this book, to try to show the mutuality of corruption, the ways in which these logics are overlapping, so that the division between the public and the private, the state and the society, the elite and the subaltern politics needs to move beyond those sort of bifurcated lens to begin to look at how things interact. And only then can we even get close to dealing with corruption, which, by the way, I don't believe that the language of war tells us that corruption can be eliminated. I do not believe, I think it's nonsense. I don't think it can be eliminated. I think corruption is something that people have to learn to live with rather than try to completely win the war over it. Actually, during field work, many transport operators went on strike, not because they were not against the corrupt system, but because there was no form of regulation. They wanted to know that, okay, there's a defined place where we pay the bribes. There is a certain amount of money that we pay. There are actors that we know that paid. So there was a certain regulation within the system. And so what happened then was that there was a felt marker that these motor packed out in conjunction with the police officers would have, where if you pay, then they would put a mark there, and then there was a form of regulation. Sometimes they were ticketed for what was going on. So there was a certain regulation in this sector that made it functional.
Understanding what the lay of the land looks like,
Yes.
as opposed to, like you mentioned in your book, new checkpoints coming up. So you have no idea just how much you're going to have to pay in bribes, because it could change from day to day. How are you supposed to then survive, right? We can all accept that, fine, I have to pay bribes, but let's at least figure out how much that has to be. And we can all work together so that it's a win-win for everybody.
Absolutely. And you touch on an uncertainty there that governs life in most cities anyway, where people have to live in a state of almost changing gears. Thinking those who are using the manual form of driving, just in a state of preparedness. And this was also important from the passenger's point of view, because as a conductor and the driver, there was no set route. Even though we ran from Alimosho to Oshodi, we always knew that based on information we get from the drivers coming in the opposite direction, that, you know what, there's so many checkpoints and so many, because the checkpoints as well are not static, they are shifting checkpoints. There are so many checkpoints, and even the sort of the alternate routes are sort of blocked by bribe demanding officers. You could easily just decide that, you know what, it's not worth my while, I'm going to run a different route, which means that the passenger gets into the bus not really knowing if they will arrive at point B. So as soon as we feel that it's not worthwhile, we could just offload the passengers, give them what we think. If they've paid $20 for the trip, we think we've taken them $10. Give them $10 trip. Say, good, we're just going to give you $20 and marry two passengers together, and we are off on our way. We're making a U-turn and we're going somewhere else. And so people have to find alternative routes. So there was that uncertainty there that sort of filtered through from the drivers to the passengers themselves. So it was a logic that governed this space.
Right. Now, we're at the Kennedy School. These are students who are studying about how to be good policymakers. What's your advice to students like these on how should they address these kinds of things? What did they learn from your research?
Great question. So the first thing I would say is that is from my own experience, right? You have an approach right here, designed here from the library, from the warmth of your room, safety of this place, about how you're going to approach these subjects, right? But there's a certain, you have to respect the uncertainty of the space you're going into and be flexible enough to change, to be open to learning from the local, and to recognize that there is a certain agency, a certain capacity for action. So the space you're going to is not tabula rasa, right? It's not a blank space that you're coming in to impose a certain theory or a certain approach. But rather think about it with the same logic of that particular space, the logic of mutuality, of conviviality, of complementarity. So in that sense, then you have something that you want to come and do. You have something you want to bring to this context. But this context also has a lot to bring to you. And how are you flexible enough to see the agency of that particular space, to understand, to be humble enough to know? I think that flexibility is very important. As my professor used to say, don't be wooden, don't be reluctant to change. I think in that way, would you write pieces you really want to write in a way that is also very respectful of the space that you're going into. So there's certainly that flexibility that I would say is very, very important. I think another thing that I benefited a lot from was the language of the particular space, knowing to speak the language, not just the formal language, it's just also the informal language, the unofficial language, the code of the street. And knowing that even if you're studying key informant and studying the state, that state is not immune or disconnected from the everyday. So in a way, some people in our social science research, we like to say we do elite interviews or we do interviews with the street people. No, they're not disconnected. And that's one of the points that I drive home in this book. You have to engage with both because they are constantly in interaction. Nigeria is preparing for elections now, and most of the money that will be used to fund the election will come on the back of motor parked out and on the back of informal transport workers, because the level of extortion on the road is escalated hugely in order to sort of, find the money that is needed for these political parties to sort of have their way at the elections. So there's a certain connection, a certain circulation and mutuality that if you don't take anything away from this talk, at least take this, that there is a conviviality, a mutuality of corruption that one has to understand. And then the public and the private is not always as clear as we like to believe in the policy world. And that policy, the best policies are policies that allow the local to inform what you have. Not doing away with what you bring into the context, but being open to complement that, to expand and complement.
Great, thank you. I really like how you talk about flexibility, adaptability, and humility. Humility is just so important in this. We are not the expert with the answers, but we're gonna come and we're gonna learn. With that, we're gonna open up for questions. We'll take questions in the room. If you have a question, if you could raise your hand. Caitlin has a microphone that we'll be passing around. For those of you on Zoom, if you can put your questions in the chat, Daniel here will be asking the questions on your behalf. We can start there. When you ask your question, please, we'll take 3 questions at a time. Please tell us your name, the program, and then you can ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. My name is Valeria. I'm an Italian researcher. I come from African studies, and then I shifted into development activism. I'm here at CID as research fellow. And your research really reminds me the research of a dear friend of mine, an Italian researcher who did a PhD in Oxford, Matteo Rizzo, who did a research on the Dala Dala system in Tanzania. So, and more or less it's the same methodology. Also engaged himself directly, became a conductor. And so my question to you is, could you please comment with a comparative perspective, the systems that you experience in Nigeria and the system in Tanzania, or the matatu system, which I lived 4 years in Nairobi. So, I mean, I use the matatu every day. So what is the difference between these 3 contexts and systems of informal transportation? Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you. Yeah, you could.
I don't know. How you doing?
Hi.
Yeah. So it's great hearing your insights, because I grew up in a family of transporters. My dad was a transporter, and on his slogan was gotten from Psalms 127 verse 1, which says, "Enemies labor in vain." So I definitely understand where you're coming from. And I myself, I've been into the transport sector, where I've served as a driver and as a conductor. And, I've also had the privilege of, working directly with the driver, for a couple of weeks, because I was working and understanding the dynamics that what happened. I could give you lots of interesting stories, but, if I'm to just go straight to one question, it's going to be like, if you were to set just one policy, around the whole transport sector, what will you do?
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for your work. My name is Miguel. I'm from the Philippines. I'm in the MPAID, or International Development Program. I find your story of throwing off the official research plan very intriguing. I am just wondering how broadly transport advocates or activists in general and young researchers will be able to engage with policymakers or hierarchical state institutions, especially when trying to explain the context that we are navigating in these spaces, especially like with the emphasis on legibility, quantitative data versus the approach of being able to understand these contexts, being able to understand how the liminalities of these spaces you can't just have one linear cause of corruption, however you define it.
Thank you. We'll come back for another round.
Wonderful. Valeria, excellent question. Matteo Rizzo, very familiar with his work, obviously. Work on the Dala system in Tanzania, which is also fascinating as a policy space. And I'll come to that with the second question. But what's the difference? Let me say the first difference is that, so Matteo Rizzo is an Italian working in Tanzania. I'm not sure if he was a conductor, but if he was, I'm sure our experiences were substantially different for the very reason that he would stand out as an, what is there's a word for the Oyibo, the white man, whereas I would become anonymous within that sense, which meant that we had differential experience with how the stigma and the violence occurred. So I think that's just, and which there's a space for both, right? In anthropology, you have the ethic and the emic, the outside and the insider perspective. So we come in complementing each other in terms of the way in which we approach, but that's sort of would be a difference in the sense that I blended in a way enough to feel that my life was constantly being threatened and I didn't really stand out. But, you know, there's a lot, one can talk about the geography of informal transport. You know, people who are in Nairobi, Kenya, in Dar es Salaam, in Kinshasa, they can share a general understanding of corruption as being, of informal transport workers as being these dirty workers, these workers who are stigmatized. So there's across the board that aspect. In terms of difference, there's a sense in which Lagosians always like to feel that they are exceptional. Nigerians always like to feel like this is one of the toughest places, if not the toughest place in that sense. In addition to the sense that they are also the giant, they see themselves as the giant of Africa, albeit a crippled giant. So there's that difference in terms of the broader sort of scope in terms of comparing Tanzania with Nigeria, that Nigeria actually has this inflated sense of being the country, but at the same time, they would defend fiercely their country, especially when they're having a soccer match. But at the same time, they are also very critical of themselves, highly critical of themselves, maybe in a way that you would not find in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania. But I think there's more that connects our research than separates us. For example, Matteo Rizzo would find similar kinds of slogan like "Life is War" in Tanzania, as I would have found in Lagos. The bus rapid transit system, which was introduced by the World Bank to sort of clean up this undesirable space, was also introduced in Tanzania. The difference being that in Tanzania, they learned to work with the initially implemented without much participation from the informal sector, but over time has been, indeed, it will be regarded as one of the slight success story in the sense of which they were able to work with informal transport workers to create sort of complementary lanes in the city in a way in which I don't think Lagos has been successful at doing. So I think those would be the slight difference, but in all honesty, there's a certain language of informal transport that cuts across, I would say, not even Africa. I think if you speak to people from Afghanistan, you speak with people from Iraq, from India, they will tell you that the tuk-tuks as well. This is also a similar kind of reality in such a way then that we can speak about a global perception of informal transport workers, sometimes derogatory called paratransit workers. In fact, people are moving away from paratransit and informal to popular transport, sort of move away from this sort of illegal space within which they are planted. So that's sort of my perception of the work. And to come to the second question, which is really interesting because you talk about enemies labor in vain, which tells you that there's a battle that they are going into, and there's a sense in which there are a lot of enemies of progress on the road, both physical and metaphysical enemies. And so words themselves, the Yoruba believe, have power. So people speak, those words are not just for display, for reading the African city, but they are also sort of an amulet, something that protects them, something that speaks power to their lives. So in that sense, then you can already tell that this is a space that is filled with a lot of bad spirits, bad energies, as well as good energies, and they have to complement each other. But going back to the area of policy, I would say policy, one policy that I would propose, a policy that works with, not against the flows of the city. So in that sense, then, let me give you a concrete example. Implementing the bus rapid transit system initially in Lagos, Lagos branded itself as a world-class city, as Africa's big apple. And so they felt that this informal transport had no place in Africa, had no place certainly in a city that aspires to become a center of excellence. This was the same thing in Tanzania. This was the same thing in Nairobi, in Addis Ababa, in South Africa. There was a sense in which this is not something that we want to be associated with. A lot of the governors from Lagos, Nairobi, and the rest, they come to MIT, they're in the walls of Harvard, they're trying to impose order on the chaos of their city. They are trying to make it plannable and readable. But this is a fundamental policy flaw, because in South Africa, for example, the sphere of informal transport was one of the first places where Black capitalists emerged. There was a sphere of Black agency. There was the Kumbis, as they are called in South Africa, was a sphere in which Black people could first become economically empowered and assert their agency within this dominant apartheid hegemonic system. So in that sense, then, I think when you do away with, when you come in there trying to replace, and you're not flexible enough to learn from the local, what you do is that you reproduce an image of Africa that comes to study it from what it is not, rather than what it is, via negative. And so from that via negative sort of approach, Africa would always be something that emerges in the popular imaginary as a problem to be fixed. But we have to think beyond that as a space of fantasy, of desire, of imagination, as scholars have reminded us, right? And so when we come at it from that angle, then a bus rapid transit project can look at the ways in which you could integrate these transport workers to run the routes that they are most efficient at running, and then use the bus rapid transit to run the other routes. You won't come in and completely do away with these forms of transport and create a dedicated lane, which is what happened in many of these African cities, and say, this is a bus rapid transit lane. So then there was protest, there was stoning of these bus rapid transit systems in Lagos when I was doing field work, because they said they want a city that looks green, that is beautiful, technologically advanced, that is modern, but there's no room for multiple forms of modernity. There's no room for us, the poor, in this city. So this is what has happened, and this is a kind of policy that fails to be flexible, to see things in mutuality rather than in separation. And those kind of policies will effectively fail. They always fail. The bus rapid transit now look like the informal transport workers because they've been run ragged. So essentially, then it's working with the flow of the city rather than against it, and seeing this not as what it's not, but what it is, and building from there. I think that's what I would say. And then the other question about how, as young scholars, how do you weave these spaces of illegibility into this legible space that we know? A classic example is the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, which goes on ranking countries, and obviously African countries most of the time will find themselves at the bottom of the ranking. But this is based on perceptions that are always removed from the everyday. And so in that sense, then you wonder if something so ingrained in society can be reduced to a single number and used to rank, which is just ridiculous. So in that sense, then you can ask them how far they have. You can look at the countries that have been ranked in the bottom since it started ranking and see if there've been any change. If not been any change, just like there are no change between developing and developed country. How many Africans since we started having developing and developed? How many African countries have made a way from developing to developed? No, because these systems are seen as a child that will never grow up. They are stunted. So they are woven into them is a rigidity. And so they need to be flexible. Not because I say it's because it's not working for them. And they are not respecting the changeability, the variability that is part of the everyday if you experience it from a lived perspective. So this is very important, and these are the ways in which we can use that argument to sort of compel policy option to not do away with their own approach, which I think is important. I'm not saying Transparency International Corruption Perception Index is not important. It puts pressure on elites, and to that extent, you know, they want to do better. But I think ultimately it misses the point of the social engineering and social dynamics that is at the heart of corruption. And that's what I would say.
Great. We're going to take another round of questions. We're going to start on Zoom this time. So Danny, if you can, those of you in the room, if you could just raise your hands and then I can at least assign where you had you don't want to ask anymore? Great. 1, 2, 3. And then we'll come back to you guys. Danny?
All right, we have 2 questions on Zoom.
Great.
First, did you find a difference in the experience of transport operators from different ethnic groups or religious groups? Okay. And then I find you're interesting. Well, the first one was Faisal Hamid. The second one from Umar Saleh says, I find your research interesting in your journey to document your experience, a very brave undertaking. How do you think the role of unions like NURTW and RTEAN has contributed to entrancement of corruption in that sector?
Clearly, we've got Nigerians on Zoom who are asking very detailed questions. Thank you for your questions on Zoom. Yeah, we'll go to in the room. The microphone's coming.
Thank you, Daniel. I love original research, and this is example of one, so congratulations for this. My name is Jamil, and I'm a mid-career student from the Harvard Kennedy School here, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Africa Policy Journal here at Czechia. I hope that we can publish something out of your work. I did my NYSC, the National Youth Service, in Ogun State. I'm from Kano. So, and I pass by Lagos sometimes, and I've seen how difficult it is navigating the transport system, which made your research even more interesting to me. Equally, also, I did my research on corruption, and and I'm quite interested in the cultural context of corruption, because I have heard you make a reference to Joseph Nye about use of corruption, the use of public office, for private gain. So how do we create, or how do we use a culturally defined notion of corruption within the Nigerian context, or within an African context, or within the developing countries context to understand corruption? And isn't that the lack of that understanding an impediment to the way we approach corruption?
Thank you. Question. Behind. And then you.
Hi, I'm Kriti. I'm from the education school, and I'm learning more about policy right now, but at heart will always be an educator. I'm also from India, so no stranger to corruption. What I've experienced and what I heard you say as well was that we have this dialogue about how corruption is bad, but we go on perpetrating it by being part of it, right, in various ways. And that's what we do in India as well. We keep telling our kids that, oh, corruption is awful, you should be honest. We have this moral dialogue with them, but we also show them that this is how you get work done, by bribing a government official to get things done. What I was wondering about was that, how do we change that conversation about corruption, similar to what he was also talking about? How do we change that conversation about corruption? And how do we talk to kids about it being a real issue? And because I think that changing the narrative for the next generation is really important to help them combat this problem. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. Thank you. And our final question there.
Thanks, David. Sorry. I'm Smriti. I'm from the MPID program here at the Kennedy School. And I just wanted to take you back to the point that you made, and you said that you've got to learn to live with corruption. So I'm curious to know, when you went into the process, were you like a staunch optimist? You said, waging war against corruption. And what was it that made you make peace with the fact that you got to live with it? And how did it, did it come about from your must have come about from your research, but also from your experience is one of them. So yeah, I'm just curious to know the turning point here. I'm sorry for the name goof up.
Great. Thank you so much for the excellent questions, Daniel.
These are great questions. Where do I start from? The first one on the ethnic sort of reading of the city, ethno-religious dimension. Just the ethno-religious register is something that registers quite powerfully in Nigeria. But in Lagos, what's interesting is that it's almost like a struggle between the Yorubas, who are often seen as the original owners of that land, and Lagos being such a melting pot for people from different parts of Nigeria and more broadly West Africa and Central Africa, that it's often called no man's land. So there's that tension between that. But I think in the transport sector was where I saw sort of that nepotism, that favoritism, even among transport operators, that the motor park tout would perhaps collect more money from people who were seen as outsiders than they would from the Yorubas, who sort of spoke their language and were seen as children of the land. Omonile, people of the land. So they would have that sort of favoritism, or the level of conviviality would be a little bit more warm, and then they would identify people like the Igbos, who were called Omoina, which is almost derogatory, people that are not from here. So there was that aspect. But I think more broadly, there was a mutuality around the frustration with corruption that cuts across ethnic identity in such a way then that for a change, this was not a space that ethnicity and religious was that dominant, even though people would appeal in the visual slogans to, I think that was where you saw sort of the non-homogeneous nature of religion. So people talk about Christianity, people would appeal to Islam, their own traditional religion for protection. But I think in terms of the feeling around corruption and its impact on them, there was a shared nature that cuts across ethnicity or religion in Nigeria. So that wasn't like prominent, perhaps because Lagos has been sort of normalized and popular imaginary as being this no man's land, as being this place where it doesn't really, and that's perhaps that's a problem, because it's historicized, and hence there's need for more scholars to historicize this space and ensure that this is not just something that is rendered anonymous. It does have a history, and this is partly what the Yorubas are trying to assert. The whole aspect of the union, the role of the union, it's really, it's funny because there's barely any book about the National Union of Road Transport Workers, which is shocking because it's a union that dominates everyday life so much, and you don't have anything. Perhaps because we've been socialized to think that this is a no-go area. You don't deal with the union. It's almost like a mafia-like space where people, life itself is very, very short. So you don't want to dabble into this space. So there's a sense in which, and the union is not just a puppet of the state, co-opted by the state. They co-opt the state in many ways. They are their own agents. Nobody co-opts the union. So in that sense, then the relationship between the union and the state is that of cooperation and conflict. That has always sort of this shifting mutuality that has always, and it's that creative tension that has always kept them going. They have managed to avoid any kind of reform. Even when Lagos was praised for being one of the most progressive city in Africa in the early 2000s, doing away with all sort of informal sector, the transport sector managed to evade that kind of reform. And they knew it, because I was talking to them and said, nobody is taking us away from anywhere. In fact, their names in Yoruba is Omoijaba, which is children of the government. So they are regarded, they are owners of the land, and they said nobody is moving us here. And there's a set of a performance rhetoric where the state puts out a rhetoric of reform, but they tell us that actually they will be here long after that reform has expired. So there's that, and so if you want to call it an entrenchment of corruption, that's one way to put it, or you can just say it's the way in which the fear imposed by union now governs everyday life. So fear has become a way of life in that sector. In such a way then that when you're an outsider coming in, when I initially came in, I did not understand the language of that space, or I had become removed from the language of that space. That after a while, I started to understand what was going on here. That there was a certain mutuality, and even and you knew there was a mutuality from looking at the money. Like, where does this money go to? Right? The money is distributed in a sort of a trickle-up mentality that goes to the local government, goes to the police officer, goes to the party officials. There's a circulation. There's a whole distribution of what in Nigeria is called the national cake. It's for sharing. It's for distributing among all the party holders. In that sense, then, that both the party holders, both the police officer, both the union officials, they are all in a precarious position. They need each other in this sort of pas de deux that is essential to survival in that particular space. So there's that sense in which entrenchments can figure in the relationship between the union and the state. And there's the whole aspect of the culturally defined notion of understanding corruption and how it can maybe inform policy. I think, as I answered earlier, I think there's a sense in which even policymakers are beginning to recognize that for all the anti-corruption movement that has happened in Nigeria, you cannot meet any Nigerian who would say we are less corrupt now than we were before, which says that there's something not quite right about it. And culturally, and I like to say critically cultural, because there's a sense in which elites sometimes abuse the notion of cultural to be primordial and say, well, gift giving, bribe, what you call bribe is gift giving. This is how we do things here. I think that is not at all how I'm using it in it. And I spent a lot of pages trying to deconstruct the notions of culture and how it is used and abused in that sense. That's not what I mean. I mean, corruption is a global phenomenon that has to be understood in its local context. So there's a sense in which we can speak of corruption, but there's also a sense in which we have to understand the language of corruption. And it's not just a language of stateness, it's also a language of society. It's a language of a dance between state and society. And I think the societal element, the street logic, is something that has not always been there, because anthropologists come and study the street level, political scientists come and study the state level. And perhaps maybe you need development scholars to look at how the street and the state combines and circulates and not demarcate petty corruption from grand corruption and political, which doesn't make sense. Because actually the corruption that people feel most aggrieved about is not the one that is looted by the leaders, which is somewhat abstract. It's the one that they experience right after they leave their door and their houses on the queue, in the checkpoints. Those are the ones that they feel particularly angry about. So one has to bring that in. So there's also the whole aspect of the paradox of corruption, which was raised using India. And India, the literature in India is one that I have, found a kindred spirit in. I'm thinking about the work of Akhil Gupta on the blood boundaries of the state. And he says not just in India, but on the post-colonial society itself, the fact that formal street level bureaucrats like the police are often not found in their offices. They are found, in the informal spaces in such a way then that completely blurs that. And the question, I guess, that I always ask, and this also goes into the other question about staunch optimist, is what is the incentive of political leaders to change a system that benefits them? Why would they want to change it? And I've never really found a convincing answer for it, because this is a system that that benefits the people in positions of power. And this is almost like a deliberate sense in which police officers, for example, there's a whole literature that they are underpaid, but there's also a sense in which they lobby to find themselves in lucrative spaces where they can export money from these officers. And it reminds me of the work by one of the Indian scholars, Anand, who talks about the hydraulic city in India, where he talks about how water pipes are deliberately left to leak because in a way, the leaky water pipes, people can tap water and not protest against the state. And so there's a sort of a leakiness around the whole idea of the state itself. So I think that's the paradox at the heart of corruption, about the question of political will and public choice, and why people want to change a system that actually they get so much from. And I think this is a challenge that I still try to figure out. But I think the staunch optimist, I went into the field being a staunch optimist. Yes, I left feeling like I was a cruel optimist, knowing that I was wedded to a system that ultimately hurt the people I know and hurt the people that I don't know. But I think that the movement, the NSIS movement against police brutality, tells us that there's a new generation that is rejecting this normality of corruption, this fact that we should live with it as a way of life, this fact that this is how it is, something that they are critiquing past generations for doing. And I think that comes with a lot of hope. That is not maybe cruel optimists, but maybe informed optimists that want pushing their government to be more accountable, more responsible. And I'll give you an example quickly from the field, that when I was in the field, transport operators who were removed from the center of the city to the margins to make way for the bus rapid transit systems, which were supposed to be icons of the modern, took the state to court. They took the state to court because they were angry that they were trying to assert their right to the city, which essentially is the right to be part of decision-making processes that affect their lives, and initially won the case in court. So we see ways in which the informal is appealing to the law to sort of reclaim their rights, and not always through forms that are seen as non-conventional, violence and the like. So there are all these spaces there, but I think before we can even answer that problem, we need to understand what the problem is. And we need to, so before we can move to the space of fixing this issue, we need to avoid just seeing it as a problem from the understanding and saying, let's understand what this problem is and what is happening here. Because as I argue, there's a vulnerability at the heart of corruption. Because all these actors, if you look at it, starting with my parents, if you just look at it from the point of view of the workers, then you miss the precariousness that is part of the ownership dimension. If you just look at corruption from the part of the state, you miss the local dimension of it. So if we understand that aspect, then maybe we can build policies that are not just inclusive, because there's a division between inclusion and exclusion. And sometimes it's not a matter of black or white or inclusion, exclusion. It's the terms under which people are included, because you can be included in policies in a way that do damage to you. What some scholars call adverse incorporation. So we need to look at the terms under which these transport operators, they are allowed to work in the city, but they don't make their way in any sort of formal constitutional document in many African countries. So in a sense, then they are part of this space, this necropolitical space where they are allowed to die, they could be exploited, their lives are disposable, but at the same time, the government has not properly recognized them as rights-bearing persons. They are non-incorporated, they are mere danglers in this space, as the African philosopher Feynman Kitty puts it. So it's a case of trying first to understand this phenomenon called corruption, and to understand that, to move beyond this thing as being the single phenomenon, because we're using the English language here, to try to say, what is the language of corruption in this local context? I said there are 520 something languages in Lagos, and I would like to know which one defines corruption single with one line or two line. I don't see it. So if that is the case, then are we talking about the same thing when we talk about corruption? And if we're not sure we're talking about the same thing, where does our ranking come from, and who is doing these rankings? And you can ask these same questions and scale it up to developments, developing, public, private, and you can find a whole lot of modern, pre-modern, a whole lot of problems, a whole lot of leaky concepts that we need to deconstruct, not throw away the baby with the bathwater, but deconstruct and make sure that we're dealing with it from a flexible sort of approach.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. With that, I think we're going to end this talk. For those of you who'd like to stay back and have a conversation, we can do that. But thank you very much, Daniel. I think particularly, I really liked this unpacking corruption, because it is often thought of as a black and white thing, which it is not, right? Petty versus grand versus public versus private. These are all in the classroom things that are easy to teach. And then you go live your real life where everything is blurred. And I think your book really is a contribution in helping you understand the life in the blur of all of these phases. So thank you very much for being with us. We can give him a round of applause. Thank you.